Hey everyone, it's Scott from Heroic Studios Gaming coming at you with another video today. Today I'm going to be talking about a book that's actually quite interesting, but also world famous, so I don't even really need to talk about it, but it's Stephen King's novel, Salem's Lot. What is Salem's Lot, if you don't know? Well, Salem's Lot is Stephen King's second novel. It came out in 1975. It was considered one of the best novels ever written and won an award for, I think it was the World Fantasy Award in 76, a year later, and then something like the Locus Award in 87 or something like that. It's considered one of the best novels ever written. It is a great novel. I read it, and I read it a long time ago, but then I read it again recently so that I could talk to you about it because I just want to make sure I had everything. But it's basically the story of Ben Mears, a writer who comes back to a small town called Salem's Lot that he once visited a few years when he was a kid somewhere in that neighborhood to stay with his aunt. And he that town had a profound impact on him, so much so that it eventually affected him as a writer. He comes back to the town and he really doesn't know anybody in town except for one teacher, but that teacher kind of only barely remembers him. So it's not like a story where everybody knows him. He just comes into town. He's like a stranger, except that he's familiar with the place. It had such a profound impact. He remembers a bunch of things about the town. And none of the people from the town remember him. It was made into a movie a couple of times. Well, actually, it was never actually made into a feature film. That is a weird thing to say, considering that so many of Stephen King's novels have been made into movies, and there are movies of this particular story. But it actually has never been made into a feature film. It's actually been made into two-part miniseries. It's just kind of like The Stand, or kind of like It. Almost exactly like It, where it was actually a mini series of 2 episodes, which basically just makes part 1, part 2 of this. It's been made twice. First was in 1979 or something like that, and then the second time was in 2004. And the 2004 stars Rob Lowe as Ben Mears, whereas the 1979 stars somebody else whose name I can't remember off the top of my head. But it's not important. We're talking about the book, not the movie. We're going to talk about the movie later. But the book is quite good. It follows this character, Ben Mears. He comes into town, but he's not the only stranger in the town. He actually was going to rent out this house that he wanted to live in for the time when he was writing this book. It was the Marston home, the Hugh B. Marston home, which is at the top of the hill and overlooks the town. But he's told that he can't rent it because somebody has already purchased it, and that somebody is actually these sort of the new people in town that are starting a antique shop and expensive furniture shop. It's Barlow and Straker is the name of those guys, and it turns out that eventually we find out that Barlow is sort of the man in charge, and Straker is just kind of his minion, essentially. Straker comes off as a very weird guy. He's bald and tall and strong, and we don't know anything about Barlow because no one sees him at all. But as soon as these people arrive in town, both Ben and these new people arrive in town, some stuff starts happening, including the disappearance of a boy named Danny Glick, who's 12 years old. He disappears, and then later his brother gets sick with something, some kind of anemia, and this anemia starts to spread. There's another couple of other people who work as caretakers of the a gravedigger and caretakers of the junkyard, and slowly people start to get weirder and weirder. The parents, after Danny, there's their son Ralphie, and then after Ralphie, the mom, and then so on, and it just starts to spread, this weird anemia. But some of the people, specifically Ben Mears and some of his friends, including Father Callahan, the priest, who's a drunken priest who's really kind of at a point where he doesn't really believe that God exists anymore, but he's not really telling anyone that, they all slowly start to realize that, the 4 of them start to realize that something's wrong, along with Suzanne, who is Susan Norton, who is Ben's girlfriend. They start piecing things together, and they start to realize that something is really wrong. And without knowing what's happening, they're really unsure until one of the boys who's been affected by this, a friend of Danny Glick, he sort of figures out that they're vampires, and he's a horror movie buff, and so he's hey, it's gotta be Dracula kind of stuff, and that sort of leads them all to kind of know what the heck they're doing. So that's what's going on, and the story follows them as they slowly try to figure out what is happening and how to stop it, and then where to stop it, because there's this cool like thing about like Barlow not necessarily being where they expect him to be, which is in the Marston home. And there's like the whole history of the Marston home and how the Marston home attracts evil. So this is a very good story, but one of the best parts about the story, I think, is that the vampires aren't what you'd expect. It's not Dracula. Stephen King was he liked Dracula. He wanted to write it better than Bram Stoker's Dracula story because he thought the story was kind of boring and more of a love story than a horror story. But he also was a fan of like ridiculous comic books, and he read some comic books that involved vampires when he was younger, and he thought, wouldn't it be cool if those were the vampires we're dealing with? So they're like over the top. So a lot of the vampire action sequences in the story are a little over the top and a little bit like kind of on the nose as far as vampires are concerned, but like overly so, because he wanted to go with like the humor of the horror, right? Like somebody draining somebody's blood while they hang upside down in the middle of town square kind of level of like ridiculously unnecessary gore for these vampires, and not so much a love story. He's like, let's not even worry about the love story. A love story might exist between Susan and Ben for plot purposes, which I won't spoil, but we shouldn't have a love story with like this guy Barlow and like the ladies in town or anything like that. Like it should just be that he's a vampire and he drinks blood and he survives off of people because that's what he does to live. So it's this cool thing, but it also takes place in a small isolated town in Maine, which is sort of classic for Stephen King, which is a very good location if you're doing a horror story because it's isolated. Things take like an hour to get to. Nobody really pays attention to like this town. So as things slowly start happening, no one outside of the town knows about it and or cares. It's a very good story. Like guys, I don't have to tell you that it's good. I don't have to give it 2 thumbs up. I will give it 2 thumbs up, but I don't have to tell you that it needs 2 thumbs up because Stephen King won awards for it, right? So that's the thing. And I'm sure that you've heard of it. I'm sure that you are like, why is he even reviewing this one? Well, I am. Stephen King did say that he would, like, it was his favorite story that he ever wrote and that he would write a sequel, but inevitably he used parts of the story he wrote 2 short stories to sort of get himself in the mood, which he then included in Night Shift, which came out in 1978. And then he kind of like left it alone for a little while until he started writing the Dark Tower. And when he started writing the Dark Tower series, he included pieces of the stories for these characters and what happened to them after the town got all vampired. And so he included those in there, and then he decided that there was no need for a sequel to this story at all. That didn't stop people from making a movie sequel of it. There was a Return to Salem's Lot movie, which was kind of horrendous. It was really, really bad. But they're going to be remaking the movies in 2023, and they're going to be planning on making it a full feature Hollywood film, so we should maybe get some kind of change to these sort of TV level films that were made for it before. But either way, if you want something creepy to read, something where the heroes are basically normal people caught up in something not so normal and really have no idea what they're doing, and they don't have a Van Helsing to refer to for what they should do. They do kind of have a character that they actually, I think, refer to as Van Helsing, their Van Helsing, but he's just a teacher who is just reading a bunch of books, and so he's basing it off of stuff that he's reading and folklore and things, not anything that's actually useful information. Then yeah, read it. It's great. It's a fun time. So not a waste of time. And I think there's like probably 100 audiobook versions out there, so if you also like audiobooks, you could totally get it on that. So that's my review of Salem's Lot, which is probably unnecessary because, like I said, other people smarter than me have given it awards for being awesome. And typical in Stephen King fashion, there was very few grammatical errors. In fact, from what I understand, Stephen King requires very little editing from his editors because he does a lot of his own editing and therefore doesn't really need it. But he hands it over to them, and they usually find very little wrong. Even though this was his second novel, there was that function too, where like they didn't really find anything wrong. So the book was published as written, pretty much. Cool. So that's it. I hope that you enjoy your October and get to get involved in creepy stuff and potentially the Few and Cursed RPG. All right. I'll see you all later.